and welcome to today's webinar on the 10 things you must know about updating your technical files to comply with the EU MDR. My name is John Spear, and I'm the founder and VP of Quality and Regulatory here at Greenlight Guru and the moderator for today's event. We have a really fantastic presentation scheduled for you today, and based on the number of people who have signed up for this event, I know that you are all very excited to dive into the details. I know our presenter, Samir Jaiswal, is really looking forward to sharing with you his insights and experience into the new EU MDR and how the regulations affect your technical files. Before we dive too deep into today's presentation and introduce our presenter and their consultancy, PRP, by the way, you can find more about PRP at www.prp-us.com. I'm going to touch on a few items real quick. First, today's webinar is going to run for about 60 minutes in total and will include a Q&A session at the end where Samir has been kind enough to answer as many of your questions as time permits. So I encourage you to submit your questions throughout the webinar as they come up in the box on the right-hand side of the webinar panel, and we will get to as many of them as time permits. Second, I want to share a few words about Greenlight Guru and why we put on these free training sessions. If you've been on one of our training sessions before, then you know we put these on because improving the quality of life is our mission here at Greenlight Guru, likely a similar mission as many of you on today's webinar. Anything that we can do as an organization that helps device makers bring safer, life-changing devices to market quicker with less risk aligns with our mission at Greenlight. We're constantly looking for ways to fulfill that mission, whether that's through hosting these free training sessions, through partnering with world-class medical device consultancies like PRP, or through our award-winning quality management software platform. If you'd like to learn more about why medical device companies all over the globe in more than 600 cities for over 50 countries are ditching their broken paper-based quality systems and outdated legacy software for a new modern quality management software platform designed exclusively from the ground up for medical device companies, I encourage you to head over to www.greenlight.guru after today's presentation and request your free personalized one-on-one demo. In it, you'll learn how the very best medical device companies are leveraging the Greenlight Guru EQMS software to gain ISO 13485 certification, breeze through audits, and push beyond just compliance to focusing on true quality. So like I said, if you're interested in learning how we might be able to help your device company, be sure to go over to www.greenlight.guru after today's session and schedule your personalized demo. All right, so let's get on to today's presentation. Let me give a proper introduction to today's presenter, Samir Jaiswal. Samir Jaiswal is a PRP consultant, EU MDR subject matter expert. He has over 2 decades of experience working in the global medical device industry with companies such as Abbott Laboratories, Boston Scientific, and Fujifilm Medical System. During his career, Samir has been responsible for the clearance of numerous Class 2 and Class 3 devices in over 70 countries. Wow, that's impressive, including major markets such as the US, EU, China, and India. Currently, Samir is consulting with a number of medical device companies seeking to comply with the demands of the EU MDR. And folks, there's quite a bit here. So without further ado, let me hand it over to today's presenter, Samir.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you, John, for that lovely introduction. My name is Samir Jaiswal, and it's an absolute pleasure to spend an hour with you this afternoon. At the end of this presentation, if you do have any additional questions or would like any more information on how to comply with the EU MDR, please do not hesitate to contact Lisa Gallagher, whose information will be at the end of this deck. And I'm sure Lisa is one of our client managers, and I'm absolutely sure she will happily put you in contact with one of our SMEs to answer your questions. So without further ado, I'm going to move into the slide deck, and we're going to talk a little bit about the EU MDR. We only have a relatively short period of time, so we're just going to touch the high points. And again, if you have any additional questions, contact Lisa, and I'm sure we can answer them for you. So let's talk a little bit about the new life cycle approach. As you know, the EU MDR is going to come into action in 2020, and it has some substantial changes. One of the things that it has is the idea of a life cycle approach. The technical documentation that we're going to continue, that you're going to create, is expected to be a living document. What does that mean? That means there's going to be a far stronger emphasis on routine reviewing and updating of the technical documentation. They're going to expect to see your routine review of requirements changes, including inputs from post-market surveillance and post-market clinical follow-up. They're going to look to see whether you are taking on board the new state of what's going on in the industry in terms of state of the art. They're going to look to see if you have reviewed legislation, standards, and specifications, and whether you have a defined review cycle. So what's the takeaway from this? You want to include the idea of reviewing your technical documentation into your quality management system so that it happens on a regular basis, and also create evidence of the regular periodic review that hits the high points of what the EU MDR requires for that review process. The other thing that the new MDR brings into place is the idea of ensuring that the information is clear, organized, readily searchable, or unambiguous. That's a new and very specific requirement. And the challenge for any medical device company is that not only does this cover information that you may hold for yourself, but also information that you're going to be required to disseminate across various other agencies to ensure that your product can stay on market. Those agencies include your authorized representatives, of course, but also the UDI database that the EU has set up, and also the European database on medical devices, commonly known as EU DMED. You're going to need to put information from your technical documents into all of these four spaces, and as you're doing regular reviews, the notified body is going to look to see that the information is consistent across those four areas. So it goes back to a little thing, a little bit that was talked about earlier, which is it's going to be necessary to look at your document management or content management systems, ensure that you can ensure traceability, ensure the consistency across these four areas, and the new regulation includes the idea of electronic delivery of information, very much like we do with the FDA today. So there as well, you're going to need to look at how you're going to submit that information to the agency. Let's take a look at the next slide. Next slide. It's going to be significantly more prescriptive in terms of the required content. First of all, let's note that the concept of the technical file or the design dossier has gone away. The MDR is very consistent in its use of the idea of a technical document or technical documentation. The technical documentation itself is heavily reliant and based on the summary technical documentation that was developed by the Global Harmonization Task Force. It isn't the same, but it uses that as a basis. And obviously, you've probably realized already that the changes are supporting the idea of a global harmonized process and MDSAP. So the idea here is that the agencies across the world, the FDA, the Australians, the Japanese, and the Europeans, all have a consistent manner of approving products, so that they can do it in one place and move it on to another and support MDSAP. So things to consider when you're checking your technical files. First of all, you should look at sufficiency. Do you have enough information to support an MDR submission? Secondly, experience. Does the technical file reflect post-market experiences? So have you included in there, if your product is already on market, have you included in there any experiences that you've had from post-market surveillance activities? Is it traceable? So that does it trace to your QMS? This in particular, as you probably realized, includes the idea of traceability to 1345 to 2016. And is it current? That is, does it include the idea of best practices, specifications, new standards, and all these sorts of things. Moving on. The essential requirements checklist has been completely revamped. If you've looked at the MDR, they now have specific sections, Annex 1 and Annex 2 and Annex 3, that covers the technical documentation. Annex 1 covers what they now call safety and performance requirements. That's a change from the idea of essential requirements. The other thing is that the safety and performance requirements, the SPRs, are far more specific than they used to be. The essential requirements were 13 vague items included in, I think it was Annex 5 of the original MDD. There are now 23 specific SPRs that you will need to address. It is good to put together a table like this. You may well have embedded the essential requirements into your quality management system, so also go back and look at your quality management system, ensure that you have changed any documentation, any templates or anything else to match the idea of the new SPRs. Annex 2 covers the technical documentation itself, and there, again, there is a change from the MDD. Originally, there were only 10, and they were fairly vague as well. They were embedded in Annex 7 of the original MDD, and the design dossier itself was only mentioned once. In the new MDR, there Annex 1 has over 40 specific items that must be covered in the technical documentation. And the Annex 2, which covers post-market surveillance, has another 15 specific items that must be covered. That makes it far more onerous to manage, and you're now going to have to place a far more emphasis on post-market surveillance as well. So now you have 55 specific elements that need to be covered. So who is responsible for all this information? So the manufacturer is responsible for the creation and maintenance of all that information, the technical documentation, both of according to Annex 2 and Annex 3 for post-market. The authorized representative must retain a copy of the technical documentation. So this, again, comes to the idea of having a document management system that can ensure congruency. You also need to appoint a person responsible for regulatory compliance, whose responsibility is to ensure that all these materials are kept up to date. And of course, the notified body is responsible for making sure that all this information exists. Moving on to the next deck. There is also a revised declaration of conformity, and this is largely based on the idea that we already have this significantly more information coming through from the technical documentation itself. So what's the good news here? You have until 2020 to start thinking about it, to start addressing this. After 2020, your products will remain certified until their current certification runs out, or 2024. So you have a little while, not a lot, but a little while. So what's changed in the Declaration of Conformity? Itself has not changed very much. It is pretty much the same. There has been some renumbering changes, but overall the Declaration of Conformity hasn't changed dramatically. The required information, however, has increased substantially. There's the new and revised SPRs that we've already talked about. There's the additional requirements for the technical documentation. And for those of you who have Class 2B active or Class 3 implantables, there will be additional third-party review. So how does this process work? So if you're in the Class 2B active or the Class 3 implantables, what would happen is that when the notified body comes in, they're going to need to put together a CEAR, which is a clinical evaluation assessment report. They're also going to have to notify the EU Commission. That's what it's called in there. I presume the EU Commission means the competent authorities. They will they are creating a CER for a Class 2B or a Class 3. The EU Commission will then have to appoint an expert panel and pass the CEAR on to the expert panel. That expert panel will then develop a clinical report, and that clinical report may do a number of things. We'll cover that in a little while. So they'll create that clinical evaluation and then come back to you. The process may also include both requesting that the notified body or you will come before the expert panel and provide additional evidence or respond to questions. So what comes out of this? Particularly if you're in the Class 2B or the Class 3, it's going to take longer because there is just more things to go through, but also there are external bodies to be involved, and it will be more expensive. So that's also something to be something to take into account, particularly if in the Class 2B or the Class 3, the Class 3 area, where these things are just going to take a lot longer than you think they're going to take. Currently, the EU Commission is suggesting 21 days for their process of receiving the CAR and appointing it to an expert panel, and the expert panel has up to 60 days to respond. And they may not always respond affirmatively, so there's going to be a cycle where we're going to, you may have to resubmit or create more clinical evidence. So think about that as you're moving through this process. Next slide. The technical documentation, we talked about this earlier, must be clear, organized, readily searchable, and unambiguous. And this includes both things like the device descriptions, the information supplied by the manufacturer, design and manufacturing information, safety and performance requirements, risk-benefit analysis, which is something that we don't generally do for the FDA, so a risk-benefit analysis, and product verification and validation. Also, you're going to need to think about that post-market surveillance information as well, and the post-market surveillance plan. So the takeaway from all of this in this particular area is you're going to need to look at your document management system or your content management system and update it as necessary to ensure that you can do regular and periodic reviews and updates. Store this information on a long-term basis. Trace this information so that it's traced not only internally within your organization, but also to the 3 other areas. Remember, you're going to be sharing this information with the authorized representative, with the UDI database, and the EU database as well, so ensuring that you can trace across all 4 of those areas so that as you make changes, you know that you can upload those changes in the other databases. Also, the information is easily searchable by the notified body or by the commission itself. You're also going to need to think about security, because if you're including information about clinical studies that isn't anonymized, or if you've got other information in there from post-market surveillance, then security, including compliance with GDPR. You're also going to look at authenticity if you're going to use this area as the documentation storage environment for your submittable documents. So looking at 21 CFR Part 11 compliance, and consistency, as you mentioned, across the 4 areas where you're going to be sharing this information. CERs. The bar has been significantly raised on clinical evaluation reports. So CERs will include the clinical evaluation itself and the resulting clinical evidence. And just remember that that includes both favorable and unfavorable data. You're going to need to document that into a clinical evaluation report, which should be part of the technical documentation. The clinical evaluation reports are expected to be living documents and must be continuously assessed based on information gathered from post-market clinical follow-up, based on the post-market surveillance plan, and the clinical evaluation plan. You'll probably notice that the MDR requires substantially more plans in place, and also the idea that these plans are going to create a life cycle for the technical documentation and the clinical evaluation reports and the market surveys, so that you are continuously maintaining a product in as safe a manner as possible and within the state of the art. So the summary and the clinical performance must be updated at least annually. So you'll want objective evidence that you're doing those reviews, and it should be inserted into your QMS to ensure that you're doing those reviews. Also remember that the updates, the CERs themselves, may trigger updates in other areas of your quality system, including the instructions for use, labeling, other things. Any clinical investigations that you're going to do have to be conducted under the new legislation as well. So there is a section in the MDR covering clinical investigations. and they must align with your clinical evaluation plan to ensure that that any investigation that you're doing work within the requirements of your plan itself. The notified bodies, and particularly, will be looking for living post-market surveillance plans and post-market surveillance follow-up. So it is necessary to ensure that we have the appropriate objective evidence, that we're looking at these things on a regular basis, we're taking input from across the organization, that we're taking input from the marketplace and the regulatory environment, and inserting that into the clinical, into our post-market surveillance activities and into the technical documents themselves. You're also going to need to look at the limitations not just of your own product but other equivalent devices. So if you're going to need to ensure that if you are using equivalency, that you're looking at what's going on with your equivalent products, so that any issues that are showing up there will also have an impact on your own product. Talking about equivalency, for those of you who've used equivalency as an argument for being certified, don't expect equivalency to be as straightforward as it was previously. In fact, fully expect more and more of them to be rejected. They're going to be far more heavily scrutinized and are going to be far more difficult to justify. Any notified body that's looking at your equivalency must specifically document their conclusions regarding equivalence claims, and they're expected, the competent authority is expecting them to reject more and more of them. The other thing that the MDR states is that you must be able to clearly demonstrate that you have sufficient levels of access to the data relating to the device in order to claim equivalency. Consequently, there's going to be a need to modify your clinical processes and documentation in response to some of these more detailed mandates. So looking at some of that specific criteria, they're going to look at three major areas: the technology of the product itself and its to show equivalency, the biological actions of the product in order to show equivalency, and also the clinical actions of the product. So from a technology standpoint, that means that they're going to look at the design of the product. Is it the same or close to the equivalent product? The conditions for use, the specifications, the properties, methods of deployment, principles of operation. These delineated in Annex 14. You also have the biologicals are using the same materials or substance in contact with the human tissue, with the same release of any chemicals or other biologicals, and also any products from as your product degrades, are they the same? From a clinical standpoint, they're going to look to see whether the product is used in the same clinical conditions or the same purpose at the same stage in the disease with the same cohort of patients. For those of you who are in the Class 2B area or the Class 3 area, they're also going to want to see that you have sufficient access to data of the equivalent, technical data of the equivalent device, including access to technical documentation. I could presume that most of you would not want to release your technical documentation to a third-party manufacturer in order to facilitate their development of an equivalent device. So as you can see, it's going to be really difficult if you're a Class B or a Class B active or a Class 3 implantable to be able to show equivalency. We're going to move on to any questions. I'm not seeing any so far. Risk manager, the other thing that is happening that changes from MDD. Previously within the MDD, risk management was essentially a standalone activity, and the clinical evaluation, post-market surveillance was something else that was separated from the two. Today, they're going to be very much more intertwined. First of all, clinical, the risk management and clinical and risk control are explicitly called out. So both in Article 10, but also in Annex 1, Parts 3 and 4. There's an explicit obligation to do risk management and risk control. and develop a risk management plan that supports this process. Risks have to be eliminated or reduced as far as possible, so they follow the ALOP principle. They must take into account the general knowledge state of the art. That means essentially compliance with 14971. And it must be a life cycle approach. So it's no longer possible to just do a risk analysis at the beginning of the project and just set it aside. From there on in, they're going to look to see how you are taking information that you're receiving about the clinical performance of the product and putting that back into the risk management process. It's going to interconnect with the clinical evaluations, including the clinical evaluation plan. It's going to be part of the continuous post-market clinical follow-up process and documented in the clinical evaluation report. It's going to be necessary to include this as a continuous cycle through the process. So as you're taking information from the outside the organization, from clinical evaluations, from clinical studies, from post-market surveillance, you're going to go back and need to be able to update your risk management and your risk control activities to ensure that the product is reducing in risk over time based on input, but also that you are signaling to the organization if you see something that is not as well going not as well as you'd like it to. The other thing that, of course, you may well be aware of is that the EU does something differently from the FDA, and that is that they include the idea of risk-benefit analysis. In fact, it's right there in Annex 1.1. So you're going to be able to balance off the risks, the residual risks, against the benefits of the product, which is something the FDA doesn't normally encourage. Expected levels of examination are also going to be raised. What does that mean? It means that this goes back to something we mentioned earlier. Particularly if you're in the Class 2B active or a Class 3 implantables, the bar is going to be substantially raised for what you're going to need to do. The notified body is going to take your clinical evaluations and your clinical evaluation reports and develop their own assessment of your clinical evaluation activities. Those CEARs are going to be passed on to the EU Commission, the competent authority, who will then pass that on to a expert panel for review. The expert panel is going to be made up of experts in the area. They may belong to a university, very much like an ethics board, and they're going to look at the CEAR and do one of four things. They're going to accept it, though they may reject it with justification. They may refuse entirely to provide any sort of scientific opinion. They may feel that it's not relevant to to this particular expert panel, or they may not respond. What's the upside of that? A non-response after 60 days means that the product is automatically cleared, which is nice. But the process, particularly if you have a rejection, where they come back and say we either need more clinical studies or more clinical evidence, or that they feel that something else was not done adequately, will mean that this will add both time and expense to the entire process. The other thing to remember, of course, is that expert panels are going to be incredibly busy. The expert panels are expected to act very much like when we do pre-submission activities, that you'll want to speak to an expert panel ahead of getting the CEAR, ahead of getting your notified body in place, to ensure that you're meeting their requirements so that you can smooth the clearance process. This is a very good practice, but obviously in the next few years, as this whole process is starting out, that means that expert panels are going to be incredibly busy. So this again drives the idea of starting your MDR remediation activities as soon as possible, because it's fairly certain that the expert panel process is going to be a bottleneck, particularly if you're in the 2B or the Class 3 area. Also, you're going to need to reassess your CERs as you have them already, to ensure that they are up to date and manage state of the art. They have got regular input in there, and make sure that they include updates to the other parts of your quality system. The other thing that I want to point out here is that the residual risk, we talked about residual risk earlier. You should ensure that your labeling is updated to include residual risk. This is important because as you're going through the post-market surveillance process, if you have included that the known residual risk in your labeling, then the item does not become reportable. So events are only reportable if they're not identified as known risks. So that's something to think about as well, particularly since the reporting timeline has been reduced now to 15 days from the previous 30. New data submission requirements, we talked about this a little bit earlier, but this is something to bear in mind. The MDR does talk about electronic submission in a number of different places. I must admit that from the EU standpoint, some of those electronic submission systems don't exist yet, but you should be gearing up to be able to support electronic submissions. So consider reviewing and modifying as necessary your document management systems or content management systems to ensure that you have the necessary electronic supports. You also need to obtain a UDI. The UDI process is a phased process, just like the FDA. The FDA has done with GU, the current process in the US. So in terms of the phase process, they're starting with a risk-based process. So class 3s should all be UDI'd by 2021, class 2As and class 2Bs by 2023, and class 1s by 2025. So the process for UDI is still a little vague, but it is something you should also be thinking about. You're going to be requested to submit information into the UDI database. It is in the MDR. There's an entire section covering UDI. So please take a look at that. That is something you should think about, and at the very least, you should use it in terms of design input into how you're segregating your data within your DMS to ensure that it is easy to pull that data out when you're going to be required to get UDI. I've done UDI myself with a number of organizations. One of the biggest challenges is resegregating the data, reassessing and realigning the data to meet the expectations for what data you're going to need to pull out of the system in order to create a UDI or create a new label. The other area is EU DMED. The EU DMED database, that's a big word, is currently behind timeline, but it's going to be active hopefully by 2020. And so you're going to need to submit information into there. So again, look at your DMS, look at your CMS, and ensure that the data terminology that the EU DMED needs is embedded into your system so that it meets that idea of being easily searchable, and so you can retrieve the data and manage that data in a straightforward process. Some of the key questions to consider. Does your document management system enable this process? It's absolutely vital since these systems since you have these systems in place and the process is changing and they're requiring it to be easily retrievable and searchable, that you look at your document management system and ensure that it includes the data types and files that you're going to need in order to both manage your own technical documentation, ensure that it's traceable and retrievable and authentic, but also the sharing of that information across the 3 other agencies that you can share it with, the authorized representatives, the UDI database, and the EU DMED database as well. Also look at what other new documents you're going to need to include, including many of the plans that the previous MDD did not require or didn't specifically call out. Do you have the processes in place as well to look at current standards or how those standards are changing and be proactive in looking at how state-of-the-art and regulation standards and the environment is changing, to ensure that you're looking at you're including that in your overall technical documentation, and also the way of any ways of assessing new or revised common specifications and changes to these particular regulations. So what do you need to do now? First of all, obviously do a gap analysis. Determine exactly what materials you're going to need, what you have today, and how you're going to need to compile it, so you've got a better understanding of where you're going to need to be a year from now, 2 years from now. Review all your existing documentation. Compile your technical documentation as well. Determine the any changes you're going to need to make to testing requirements, standards, other things. Review the clinical data and upgrade your CERs, and review your proposed labeling as well. There's some significant changes there as well as the entire section again in the MDR about labeling, and your instructions for use. It is also vital, given where we are today, that you've assessed the timeline for these activities. There is no doubt that notified bodies are going to be in short supply, as well as people like myself, in order to help you make this happen within the timelines of anything between 2020 and plus 4 years after that. The EU is very open in stating that the notified bodies are going to be the bottleneck. And so getting your documentation in place and expecting BSI or any of the other notified bodies to have people available is going to be challenging. I would suggest you start booking those organizations as soon as possible. Because if you notice in MDR, there's an entire section that covers also the duties and expectations of notified bodies. So something I'd like to point out here is that notified bodies are now going to have to ensure that when they come to do an audit, there is at least one person that is familiar with the technology or the product space that they are auditing. What does this mean? That means they're going to have somebody there who is competent to review the product that they're actually looking at. It's going to be challenging for notified bodies to have somebody who knows about stents, or knows about cardiac defibrillators, or knows about pumps. And having those people on staff and available so that they can go and do audits is going to be challenging in its own right. The EU understands this, and they're expecting this to be a bottleneck. So what I would suggest is that you look at your ability to get a notified body in place and move back from there to understand how quickly you're going to need to get these other things in place, including upgrading your technical documentation, making sure that your CERs are in place, and everything else. The other two areas that you're probably going to want to look at is ensuring that your quality management system is up to date with the new ISO 13485-2016 standard. That will also need an inspection. Whilst 1345 is not specified in the MDR, they do talk about state of the art. And if you choose not to use the 1345-2016, you're going to need to be able to justify it in some way or manner. So what does the overall transition timeline look like? This, as you can see here, the regulation came into force in May of 2017. There is a 3-year transition period out to 2020. IVDR, if you're in the IVDR space, there's a longer transition period. How long can your product stay certified? From the date of certification to the plus 5 years, as long as it doesn't go over 2024, which is the absolute cutoff date. So 2024 is when all previous certifications will cease being grandfathered, and you'll need to be certified in the new product. The only thing I want to tell you on this one is that that every manufacturer in the world who is shipping or selling in the EU is looking to do this at the same time. I would suggest that there aren't enough bodies in this space to ensure that all of this gets done to that timeline. The downside, of course, is that if you miss that 2024 timeline, or your certification runs out past 2020 but ahead of 2024, you're required to take your product off market. So that is something to think about as well, in how quickly you want to start working on this, and what activities are going to happen across your organization to support compliance with MDR, compliance with the ISO standards, both 1345 and 14971, but also GDPR and other things, which are all part of this new MDR process. You'll notice that they talk about state of the art and about data security and ensuring patient data is appropriately protected. That's the end of my presentation. Again, I just want to point out that if you have any additional questions over and above what we're going to be talking about for the next 10 or 15 minutes, then please don't hesitate to contact Lisa, who's one of our client managers. I'm sure she'll put you in contact with the appropriate SMEs at PRP to answer any of your questions. So with that, I'm going to stop for a moment and accept any questions.
Samir, thank you so much. That was really, I know you and I chatted before today's session for a moment, and you admitted that an hour was not going to do it justice, but it's just going to skim the surface. So there are quite a few questions. We'll get to as many as time permits today. First question comes from Nels. Nels asks, if the DMR is finished, the DHF is approved, and the product is commercialized, does the EU MDR require us to go revise the DHF to current ISO standards and country requirements?
Yes, but not until you're ready to resubmit. So the process is, if you have a product on market today and it is certified currently for the EU, that certification continues for the life of the certificate or 2014. So I presume, so what that means is that, let's say you already have a product on market, its certification is good until, say, 2021. When you resubmit for certification, you'll be required to be compliant with the new MDR. In any case, irrespective of when your certification runs out, you will be required to be compliant by 2024.
All right, very good. Yeah, go ahead.
No, so time is of the essence, because there's you as an individual organization with your product line and every other company out there, all going to be pushing to get notified body review, and also to get their CE marking all done at the same time. And particularly if you're in the Class 2B actives or the Class 3 implantables, you're going to need to address both the EU Commission and expert panels, and may be asked to create more clinical evidence than you have today. All of this is going to take time and energy. So all I can say to you is get started as soon as possible. This isn't something to put off, because it's not just your work that's going to need to be aligned. It's also going to be notified bodies, potentially the EU Commission and expert panels, to ensure that you can maintain your certification.
All right.
Answer your question.
Well, I guess we'll find out if Nels types a response. And Nels, if you have more details, feel free to ask another question, or you, as previously mentioned, feel free to reach out to Lisa and the PRP team. The next question comes from Steve, and Samir, I know you mentioned this early on in your presentation, but it might be worth revisiting briefly. Where do you obtain, and this comes from Steve, where do you obtain the essential requirements checklist?
The essential requirements checklist is actually in Annex 1. So if you go to the MDR and pull Annex 1, the essential requirements checklist is actually there. So they delineate every single one of the, let me back up a second, and let's get the terminology correct. We're not looking at essential requirements, we're looking at safety and performance items. So I'm going to go back to that particular slide, and we can take a look at that. All right. The essential requirements checklist is now being revamped as we talked about. I'm just going to pull my notes. There we go. Into the safety and performance requirements, every single one of those defined in Annex 1. You can go take a look at them. There are 23 specific ones that you'll now need to address. What I would suggest is that whilst there's not a huge amount of additional data, there is additional data. So as quickly as possible, you should be looking at your current essential requirements, mapping them to the SPRs, and looking for gaps in the process. Do you have adequate information to support the new SPRs, and where you have gaps? And those gaps will arrive in a number of different areas, probably in risk analysis and in any clinical evaluations or clinical evidence that supports your product. because those have also been heavily revised in the new MDR, and any plans and processes you have in place in the appropriate objective evidence. But you certainly want to look at tracing that as quickly as possible.
All right, great. And yes, folks, I know a few of you are asking, can you get a copy of the slides? Yes, after today's presentation concludes, you'll get an email with a copy of the slides and also a link to replay the presentation on demand. Next question comes from Clemens. Clemens asks, Clemens is asking if we can send the presentation. Yes, of course. Oscar also asking about the slides. Samir, apparently you've got a popular presentation. Let's see, let's get to one that's not asking for the slides. Ilsa is asking, is there any guidance how extended the design and manufacturing overview must be in the technical file?
Good question. There is very little guidance from the EU currently. They are developing guidance. You can find some information out there, but this is happening in real time. How much information they're going to require may also vary from notified body to notified body. So unfortunately, I can't give you a definitive answer there.
Yeah, and then that's, folks, I know it's frustrating, and don't shoot the messenger, but this is one of those things where, you know, it's we're all learning about this all at the same time. So it's a little
Please
challenging.
understand the challenge here is not just from the manufacturer side or the EU side. This is a major revamp of the regulation from the EU side. So they're still trying to figure out what they actually expect from manufacturers. But more importantly, the EU has placed a whole bunch of new requirements on the notified bodies. In fact, there's an entire annex in the MDR that covers governance of notified bodies. And so the notified bodies themselves are pushing very hard to figure out what their expectations are in terms of both review of the information, but also this additional requirement for reviewing of the clinical evaluations, creating these clinical evaluation assessment reports, and how the process works in terms of submitting this information to the Commission, notifying that there is a CAR on its way, and how the expert panels are being put together. In reality, there aren't even many expert panels currently in place, and so this whole process is all brand new for all the parties involved. So unfortunately, I cannot give you any specific answers as to how long this process will take or what the expectations of the various agencies will be.
Yeah, it's, folks, we're all in this together, and you know, we're all trying to learn from each other. So, you know, I certainly appreciate everyone signing up and participating in today's webinar, but you know, do reach out to PRP and Samir and the team at PRP, because, you know, they're leading the way, they're leading the charge on this, and they got their finger on the pulse for sure. So next question comes from James. James asks, if clinical investigations are designed and conducted in compliance with ISO 14155, will the requirements of MDR be satisfied?
Yes, in general. So the MDR does have a number of specific requirements for clinical studies and clinical evaluations that are over and above or different from the ISO standard, as you'd expect from a regulator. So I would again recommend that you go back to the standard, look at the appropriate annexes. I think it's Annex 14 and Annex 15, and take a look at tracing the standard to the appropriate annexes to find where the gaps exist, and put your clinical study plan together based on that. I don't think I told you anything dramatically new there, but just compliance with the ISO standards is, from my reading of MDR, not going to be sufficient because there are differences.
All right, great. So next question, and folks, I apologize in advance if I do happen to mispronounce your name, but next question comes from Manasi. Manasi asks, what should be the strategy to approach equivalency argument in order to avoid rejection?
I pointed out, as I pointed out, there are three specific areas that the agency is going to, the notified body is going to look at. The thing to remember here is that the challenge with equivalency is the amount of data that the notified body is going to be required to review and ensure exists in order to claim equivalency. So it's going to largely depend on what the risk profile of your product happens to be. One of the things I'd recommend right across this whole activity is the MDR does include the idea of risk-based work right across the MDR, right across the compliance spectrum. What that means is that if you're going to make the equivalency argument, the first argument you need to make is what is the risk rating of your product? And if it's a relatively low risk rating, they're going to ask for less evidence. But if you're heading up towards the class 2Bs or particularly the class 3s, the level of evidence becomes onerous, if not impossible. As I said earlier, particularly if you're a class 2B or a class 3, the notified body is going to be required, and it's in the regulation. So, like as I said, the amount of information on how a notified body will behave and what the expectations on them is significantly greater than it was before. I think there's almost 30 pages on how the notified body is expected to behave and what they're expected to review. So the idea that the agency, the notified body is going to want to see that you have access to technical documentation, particularly for class 2Bs and class 3s, of any product that you are expected to, that you're trying to show equivalency to, is going to make that process essentially impossible, unless you can find a manufacturer who is willing to give is willing to share with you their technical documentation, which frankly I'm not sure how many of you on the line would be willing to go to your CEO or your product managers and say, we're going to release our product technical documentation, our entire DHF or DMR as we know it today, to a third party, a potential competitor. So again, the answer is it's going to be substantially more. It's going to be a lot harder. The levels of the barriers in order to show equivalency are substantially higher than they were. My gut feeling is they're substantially higher than what the FDA expects as well. And so the other thing is that because the notified body is going to be held accountable for a lot of these issues, they're going to be conservative to start off with. So my suggestion is, A, make sure that you have as much information as possible and you'll clearly address the three areas of technical, biological, and clinical activity, and can trace those directly to information. And that you are ready to make the argument that the risk profile of your product does not increase risk to patient. If you're a class 2B or class 3, I would be concerned at this point.
All right, great. So question from Ilsa, it's about risk. And yeah, and it's made as a statement, but I'm sure you can figure out the question. Must it be all individual risk or only the overall risk that must be weighed against the benefits? I guess there's a question in there. So
I'm sorry, I missed that. There was a slight cutout. Could you repeat the question?
Let me reword it a little bit. So when weighing the risk against the benefits, is it about the individual risk items or the overall product risk?
It's the individual risk items. So what they're looking at very definitively is what risk that they're looking at. Have you assessed the riskiness of the product in terms of its? I would stick with the same things that we talked about earlier, which is the technical risk, the biological risk, and the clinical risk. I'd marry it with the idea of a equivalency evaluation. And looking at those areas, they're going to want to see, have you reduced the risks in all those areas to as low as possible, and have you evaluated the residual risk to ensure that the risk to patient health and safety is as low as possible, and then if whatever residual risk is left, assessing that against the benefit of the product. So if you look at Annex 1, Part 3 and Part 4, I believe they talk about the idea that you're going to look at the residual risk and assess it against the benefits of the product and ensure that the benefits outweigh the risks on the residual risk after you've done everything that you can possibly do to ensure the safety and efficacy of the product itself. Elsa, I hope that answers your question.
All right, so let's see here. Here we go. A question from Ardell. Ardell states, we manufacture Bluetooth Sonic toothbrush with mobile app monitoring for the EU market. Is this product under EU MDR and what device class? That's a very specific question.
That's a very specific question, and it's really difficult to answer. Possibly is all I can tell you.
All right.
And I know that's an unsatisfactory answer, but we would have to assess the product in a little more detail.
Yeah. So Ardell, reach out to the PRP team, and they can dive into that a little bit more depth and detail. He or she does have a second part of the question. We also have ISO 13485 certification. Do we need to put our device in UDEMED?
I think that marries on to, do you need a notified body? Do you need a notified body assessment, and if you audit, and if you do need a notified body assessment, that means your product is a class 2 at the very least. So possibly, or a class 1 with sterile or measuring function. So again, it comes down to how you classified. If you're not classified, then you don't need notified body assessment. If you're at a significantly low, either not classified or at a low classification, you're going to need notified body assessment. If you need notified body assessment, you're going to need to submit to EU DMED and place your information on there. The exact amount of information that's going to need to go into EU DMED has not been defined yet. You can't even get into EU DMED currently. And so that's another thing that you should consider as a bottleneck. I'm glad it was brought up. Compliance with UDI and EU DMED is going to be, I'm going to guess, something that the EU is going to make available later on. It's already 2018, in 2019 or 2020, and that information is going to need to be submitted in order to stay on market when you go to recertification. So think about all of these different areas where from a planning standpoint, there are a number of hurdles we need to jump through in order to either recertify or bring a new product to market. Over the next 4 to 5 years, all of the resources necessary to make that happen, both from a MDR compliance standpoint, from a notified body standpoint, from a EU Commission standpoint, and an expert panel standpoint, and access to UDI and to EU DMED are going to be in very, very short supply. So the overall takeaway from this is don't wait to make this happen. If you wait, there is a strong probability that the resources necessary will simply not be available. And what that will mean for you is that your product certification will run out and you'll be forced to bring your product off market. 4 years may seem like an awful long time. It really isn't when you have to line up all these different resources, as well as upgrading your quality system to 1345 2016, taking on board 14971 and getting into active monitoring of legislative changes or standards around the world. This is going to be a major shift in how you do business in the EU, and currently I would suggest that the MDR is substantially more onerous and substantially more detailed than for just about every other major regulator out there. And there is no experience by the notified bodies or the EU Commission on how they want to make this all happen. So we're in a perfect storm here. Nobody really knows what the outcome is going to be, and a lot of the support systems from the EU Commission are not in place yet. Yeah. So the response here is get as much as you can done as early as possible.
Yeah, it's like I said a moment ago, folks, we're all learning through this at the same time. All right, so next question comes from Matthew. Matthew asks, are there going to be established forms released by the EU Commission for items such as the PSUR, various plans, translated declaration of conformities?
It's not traditional for the EU Commission to release those types of templates. So I'm going to suggest that probably not. However, the notified bodies will probably start developing templates and guidances around how they are going to do their certification audits and what they're going to be looking for. So I wouldn't rely on the Commission to provide this information. You're going to need to address your notified body or notified bodies. And again, this is going to be part of an ongoing conversation between whoever is going to be helping you with the MDR compliance, but also with the notified bodies in terms of what information they can provide for you. I would not expect the EU Commission to provide this side of information. They traditionally don't.
All right, so Samir, I know we're right up at our time. Do you have time for one more question?
Sure.
And folks, there are quite a few of you who had questions that we didn't get to. Rest assured, these will be provided to the PRP team, and expect them to reach out to you in the coming days. And so, and if for some reason that they don't respond in the time that you want, Samir, I don't know if it makes sense to go to the contact page again before we wrap up, if you want to advance to that slide with all the contact details, just so folks know how to reach out and who to reach out to. But do reach out to Lisa as well. But this last question comes from Bill. Bill asks, what is acceptable for post-market surveillance in a first-time submission?
Very good question. What is acceptable? I frankly could not tell you. I know what the regulation says, and I know what in general they're going to be ramping up the amount of information you're going to need to gather, because you'll notice that not only are they asking for post-market surveillance information on your product itself, but particularly if there are equivalent products on the market, they're also looking for general market signals, for you to look for general market signals. Has your competitor product changed? If so, why? Or have there been recalls of other products in your marketplace that are similar? Have there been engineering change notices that have gone out from other areas? So all of this post-market surveillance is not now just concentrating on your own product. It's also is looking at the product market in general to see what is going on in there, particularly if you've claimed equivalency. Your post-market surveillance plan is going to be critical to compliance, and so this is something you should spend a lot more time on. It was barely mentioned in the MDD. Now there's an entire annex that talks about post-market surveillance. The purpose here is to ensure that products are as safe as possible, and as a reaction to a number of issues that have occurred in the European market with products that have caused problems post-market. And so the EU Commission is reacting to ensure that products are as safe as they can possibly be, and the manufacturers are taking as close a look as possible, not just at their own product, their own specific product, but how the market for that particular product is reacting and how patients are reacting to that particular area. So if you're in, say, the stent market, you should also not only be looking at how your stent is performing and the complaints that you're receiving, but also has the general stent market received any, have there been any general recalls? What types of recalls are going on? Are there other issues that are happening within the stent market that may indicate that there may be a problem that you haven't recognized within your own product space yet, but may become a problem at a later date? This also becomes a significant issue if you're in the disposables market, where you may well be getting fewer complaints because the traditional way of dealing with a product that doesn't work very well, a specific item that doesn't work very well, is to simply throw it away and open another packet. Again, you're going to need to be more detailed about how you manage post-market surveillance in those areas. I hope that answers that question.
All right. And folks, I guess help me by applause or whatever way you show appreciation and thanking Samir Jaiswal, a PRP consultant, for sharing his EU MDR subject matter expertise. So Samir, thank you so much.
It was a pleasure. Thank you, everybody, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
And folks, as I mentioned before, if you'd like to learn more about how Greenlight Guru might be able to help you with your quality management system needs, you should go to www.greenlight.guru to request more information. Thank you, and look forward to seeing you all or having you all join us on the next webinar. This is John Spear, the founder and VP of Quality at Greenlight Guru.